Welcome to Enlightenment and Romanticism. You very well may ask the question, if that's the name of this course, why on earth is the very first lecture I'm looking at titled Baroque, which was a period that predates the Enlightenment? And that is a wonderful question. We are starting here because as wonderful and as amazing as the Enlightenment is, you will not truly appreciate just how magnificently different it was if you don't have a good understanding of what came before. And what came before specifically was the Italian Baroque. Now, of course, I'm also somewhat biased because this is my absolute favorite period of culture, just hands down. And I think you'll see why when we get started. But what you need to know about this period is that, first of all, it's amazingly similar to our modern world, and it combined two very seemingly contradictory items, which is piety and extravagance. Piety or piety, that basically is just religion. Okay, so this was a period that was intensely religious, intensely focused on the traits of Christianity, both Catholicism and Protestantism. Yet at the same time, it was extravagant, it was wild, it was passionate, it was intense. And oftentimes, those two things do not seem to go together. Yet, when we actually start going through this period, I think you'll see and you'll understand why it made such perfect sense at this point. The basic foundation of the Italian Baroque comes from one man, Martin Luther. I don't know how much background you have in his actions in his lifetime, but he was truly a monumental figure who single-handedly wanted to take on the Christian church. Now, essentially what happened is this. He was a monk. He was extremely devoted to the teachings of Jesus, to Catholicism, and so forth. But he also looked at some of the things that the church was doing, and he was just unhappy. One of the major problems Luther had with the Catholic Church was the sale of indulgences. And indulgences basically were free passes for sin. So basically, I want to commit a little adultery next week. If I give the church $20, will that cover it? Okay, cool, that's great. And Luther looked at this and quite rightly said that that's absolutely wrong, that there's no way that the church should be accepting money in exchange for sin. And more importantly, what was happening was that the poorest of the poor, the peasants, the people who were basically starving in the streets, were taking what little bit of money they could to try to buy their way into heaven instead of actually taking care of their families. And so Martin Luther quite famously took his list of grievances and nailed them to the wall of the church. And these were known as his 95 Theses. Now, one thing has to be absolutely clear. His intent was not to fracture the church, was not to bring down Christianity, not at all. He was a monk. He just wanted to make it better. But the church responded in a very antagonistic way to him. He was excommunicated, and basically Europe was led into 200 years of warfare. Think about that. 200 years of open warfare in which Protestants were fighting Catholics, and even Protestants were fighting other Protestants, and so forth. But when the dust started to settle and when everything came to a head, basically, the church looked at Martin Luther's list and kind of grudgingly admitted, okay, fine, maybe we do have some issues here that we should address. And they started what became known as the Catholic Reformation to actually kind of take back what they had lost. This started in some ways with internal reform. You know, the popes aren't going to have children anymore. The popes aren't going to be, corrupt and massively focused on wealth and so forth. However, they also wanted to recapture the lost believers, because basically what had happened at the end of the day is that all of Northern Europe, more or less, had left the church. They had started their own Protestant faiths and abandoned the Church of Rome. And that was really bad for two reasons. Okay, for one reason, from a purely spiritual sense, as far as the Catholics were concerned, that's half of Europe going to hell. Okay, they didn't want that. They actually did, want to try to be the salvation for those people, and they did not acknowledge that Protestantism was going to get them there. So that's a problem. We need to save all those sinners. But the other problem is, if you think about all the wealth that had been stripped away from the Catholic Church as a result of the Protestant Reformation, That's an awful lot of people who are no longer tithing to the Church of Rome. Let's get that back too. And so what they did was they launched this massive campaign to actually try to win those people back. And that campaign basically was the Italian Baroque. Now, the Italian Baroque is thus named for a very clear reason, because it obviously was headquartered in Rome at the beck, basically, of the popes. And this is the new style, and there's something unique here. This is basically Rome's last hurrah as cultural leader. They start this Baroque period, and they're obviously going to be very influential, as you're going to see. But this is the last major art movement to generate, any sort of, international following, because pretty soon France is going to be stealing the crown of religious and artistic dominance, and Rome is going to become kind of a second-tier art city. But nonetheless, they still are dominating right now, and they become excessively detailed and grand and flamboyant in their style. However, even though they are so excessive, they are extremely Christian, extremely focused on Christ. And as I mentioned before, that really became apparent in the architecture, especially the churches. You can't talk about Rome and the Italian Baroque without talking about St. Peter's Basilica, a section of which you see in front of you. When I say flamboyant and excessively detailed, I think you can see exactly what I mean by looking at it. There is not 1 square inch of that surface that is not decorated, and we have intricate carvings on all the walls and all the columns. We have beautiful paintings on the ceilings. That's a huge part of Baroque here as well. And if you see, there's quite a bit of gold trim everywhere. Now, if you think about the northern European faiths, the Protestants, the Baptists, the Calvinists, and so forth, this is not what they could do. Like, literally, even if they wanted to design churches this extravagant, they frankly didn't have the money to do so. So this truly was the church kind of pulling out all the stops to show people, look at this, look at what we can give you, and look at what you're giving God when you support our church. This slide shows us 2 interior shots of St. Peter's Basilica. The slide on the left, or the portrait on the left, basically shows you a little alcove. And again, just to kind of demonstrate how detailed and ornate all the different aspects were. And we see an integration, if you notice, of some minor sculpture, paintings, tons of geometry. So we're still influenced by the Renaissance here, but just literally every single inch of it covered. Now, on the right, what you see is actually a famous altar that is known as the baldacchino. And it's kind of hard to tell from a scale standpoint here, but it is absolutely massive. It's, I want to say about 20 feet high. It's ornate, it's spiraled, it's detailed. And if you notice kind of the spiral columns going up, they are so fine and intricate that at first they were actually afraid that it wasn't going to be able to sustain the weight of that really heavy top piece. Now, St. Peter's Basilica is where the bones of St. Peter, the first pope, and also, of course, the apostle to Jesus, are supposedly laid to rest. And so it has to be excessively grand. And in fact, after the basilica was completed and kind of refurbished in this Baroque period, the Catholic Church has said that every other church built anywhere in the world must be able to fit inside of the basilica, meaning that none could be bigger or more grand, because how can kind of the home of the Catholic Church be smaller in scale compared to somewhere elsewhere? This is a shot of the exterior St. Peter's Basilica. And if you look at the dead center, what you see there is actually the original part of this church as it was initially constructed under the design of Michelangelo, our Renaissance hero. And when you look at what he put out there, it is a very typical Renaissance design. We see all those beautiful columns, we see the triangular pediment, we see the balance, the harmony, everything is perfect, which is exactly what the Renaissance was about. However, there was a very important addition to this during the Baroque period, and that are those colonnades that you see extending from that facade straight up and then kind of around to create that huge piazza in the middle. And of course, that is where all the Catholic devotees come together in order to be blessed by the Pope to celebrate Easter and so forth. Now, the colonnades themselves, of course, have some Renaissance aspects. I mean, the fact that they're columns alone is that. But the component of this that makes it truly Baroque and what makes it so unique, frankly, is that when it was designed by an artist by the name of Bernini, an extremely important man you're going to get to know very well in the next 2 weeks. He designed them, though, literally to be the arms of the church. He wanted this basically to represent the church itself, stretching out and embracing its people every time they would come to show their devotion to Christ. And that component, kind of that emotional and that physicality that we see, is truly, truly, truly what the Italian Baroque was about. And in fact, what a lot of people were kind of uncomfortable with was the fact that there was a lot of sexuality to the Baroque. Now, so far we've been looking at buildings. Obviously, you're not going to see a lot of sexuality with buildings, even if the arms are reaching out trying to hug you. But when we start talking about the sculpture, that is going to change. And Bernini, the same architect who designed that colonnade, and he also did the baldacchino, by the way, inside, that spiral altar in the center of St. Peter's Basilica, he was actually most famous as a sculptor. And what you see before you on this page right here is one of his most famous pieces. It is called The Ecstasy of Santa Teresa. Saint Teresa was a Spanish nun who actually was, obviously extremely devout. If she's a nun, clearly that would be the case. And she actually published a book in this period describing the religious experiences she had when she was in deep meditation in her little closet where she lived in Spain. And basically, one of the visions she experienced was that she was in her room praying desperately to Christ when all of a sudden an angel came to her and basically started elevating her. And what you see before you is the angel himself. And if you look in his right hand, he is clasping a golden arrow. Well, the vision that Saint Teresa experienced was the angel taking that golden arrow, plunging it into her body, pulling it out, plunging it back again, in and out, in and out, in and out. And her reaction was to describe the most intensely pleasurable yet painful experience that she has ever had in her life. Now, I hope you brought your dirty minds with you, because that should sound sexual. Even though this is a nun who probably did not have any sort of experience in the real world with that, she is describing an intensely sexual exchange basically with this angel. And when Bernini was trying to convey that in sculpture, what he chose to do is, as you can see, is he's basically showing the nun's rapture at this experience as her head is thrown back, her eyes are closed, her mouth is kind of slack, and then you see the wild, turbulent waves of her gown. That is meant to kind of show you kind of the passion that's roiling beneath the surface as the angel kind of looks on lovingly, at the same time. Now, what you also see in this is kind of the bright gleaming lights, the rays of lights kind of coming all around her during this experience. And in fact, what's truly amazing, it's kind of hard to see here, but she is actually levitating in the sculpture. If you notice, her foot all the way down at the very bottom is not touching the rock. Bernini actually found a way to actually hold the figures kind of hiddenly in the back. And so it really does appear as if the sculpture is floating before you. The advances that they had made, from kind of the perfection that they had achieved in the Renaissance to now, allowed them basically to take sculpture in a whole new way, somewhere that, people had never basically seen before. And I know you remember David. Of course, this is Michelangelo's David, that epitome of perfection, of calm intellect, of reason. Even though he's about to go out and face a monster, he's totally cool with that. And he's reasoned and has no fear whatsoever. That is the Renaissance. Let me show you what the Baroque did with the exact same story. This is what we get instead. This is also Bernini. This is Bernini's David. And I want you to notice a few major differences here. For one thing, even though we still have, a very, fit, athletic looking person, that is like Michelangelo's David. He is not calmly sitting by and contemplating what it's going to be like to actually be fighting the monster. Instead, he's got his hand with the rock. He's got the sling about to go. He is literally in mid-swing. And if you look at his face, he has this intense, passionate focus of his anger and his resolve, basically, that he is going to fight to the death if need be to stop Goliath from conquering his people. This is a beautiful representation of the Baroque, of its passion, of its intensity, of its eagerness. And what's funny is that this is a statue that was not designed to be looked at from just one point of view. Literally, it's a 360 type statue where you can walk around. And they have actually done studies. People have kind of sat in the corner of the museum where this particular piece is housed and watched people as they go up to look at it and look more closely. And what they found, which I just find absolutely hysterical, is that people are really hesitant to stand exactly in front of it. Everyone stands to the left or to the right, and they don't want to face David head on. And the reason for that, people have claimed, is that there's so much like intensity and action with the piece that it's almost as if people are afraid they're going to be in the way when he lets the rock loose and they're going to get hit by it. Now, if a piece of rock, if a piece of marble can convey that to you, that has to tell you something about kind of how powerful and how amazing the artwork became of this period. We don't want statues that are just standing around looking perfect. We want the experience and the passion that we all experience in real life. Now, that same intensity and passion absolutely carried over to the painting as well. But just like we saw major changes between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we too are going to see some major changes now from the Renaissance into the Baroque. The paintings, just like the sculptures, are going to become much more intense and much more passionate. And the first major change we see with this is in the color schemes. I'm sure you remember Michelangelo with his beautiful pastels and the lovely bright colors. I'm sure you remember Da Vinci's Sfumato too, where everything was kind of melding together. What we have instead with Baroque painting is basically the exact opposite of that. It's called tenebrism, okay, which is extreme contrast. Extreme contrast. And you're going to see exactly what I mean in a moment. In addition, we had worked so hard to gain that atmospheric perspective. I mean, we remember back in the Middle Ages, they didn't give us backgrounds. We didn't get detail. Everything was kind of very inaccurate and just floating in space. And even though they achieved that beautiful atmospheric perspective in the Renaissance, what we see is almost an immediate moving away from it and instead looking for just very dark, bleak, black backgrounds. Now, the idea was to heighten the feeling and kind of to intensify what the viewer experienced. And you'll see some examples of that as well. Now, another big difference, and I think another reason why I like this period so much, is that it recognized that the world was not perfect. That the average person does not spend every single day of their life in church or living in like beautiful, expensive, well-made houses. That the reality is there's an awful lot of Europeans out there that are kind of barely getting by, that spend a lot of their times in bars or on street corners and having a much more rough existence than perhaps we would like to believe. And the church finally recognized that this is true, and as a result started painting or encouraging painters to set their paintings in these less idealized settings. How can we actually win back the Protestants if we don't speak to them kind of in the realities of their life? And for the same reason, let's use contemporary dress and contemporary people. Let's not pretend we're Romans anymore, guys, because you know what? We're not. They've been dead for about 1,000 years, and we've got to move on. Last little technique as the focus I want you to look at was something called foreshortening. Even though we had atmospheric perspective and vanishing point in the Renaissance, they still absolutely stick to vanishing point. That's massively important in the Baroque period. But what they want to show is kind of give you the feeling almost of a three-dimensional aspect where the figures are receding into the background. Okay, so you don't actually see kind of where they go. it just kind of gets really dark and hazy back there, and they just disappear. This is a fascinating technique, and it adds a lot more kind of depth and individuality to the paintings. And as far as theme goes, what we also see is an awful lot of sexuality and physical ravishment in this, which again touches the viewer kind of in a much more powerful way than just kind of the idealized, let's go have a picnic by the tree type paintings that we saw a lot of in the Renaissance. The painter who was most important in this period was a man by the name of Caravaggio. You cannot know enough about Caravaggio. And in fact, this week you're going to be looking at a wonderful view of his life known as The Power of Art. The painting you see before you here is known as the Crucifixion of St. Peter. And St. Peter was, of course, the first Pope, recognized nowadays as the first Pope of the Catholic Church. He was Christ's most devoted disciple. And he he moved to Rome and kind of started basically the machinations of the Catholic Church in his old age, which is why you see him now as an elderly man upside down. Now, the first question you may be asking, though, is why is he upside down? And that is because, according to tradition, when he was about to be martyred for his faith, because remember, at the very beginning, right after Christ died and when those first apostles were still knocking around, Rome was still pagan. They had not converted to Christianity. And so Peter was a troublemaker as far as the Romans were concerned, and he ultimately was martyred for his faith. And he too was going to be crucified because that was the Roman way of execution. However, Christ was crucified. Peter believed that he was not good enough to be killed the same way Christ was. And so he requested to actually be crucified upside down, just so that he could actually be paying more respect to Christ. And the Romans were happy enough to oblige him. Now, what aspects of this make this painting very distinctly Baroque? First of all, you see that tenebrism, that extreme black dark background with almost like a searchlight focused on the front to really give you that major pop of color in the front with that sharp contrast in the back. We see realism. We have Peter here, not as a beautifully buff David type character, but as an old man with a little bit of flub on his tummy, with gray hair, with wrinkles, with the signs of his age. And probably my favorite component of this picture is if you look at the very bottom left-hand corner, the man who's helping to push up the crucifix, look at his feet. He's got dirty feet. I can guarantee you could look as long as you want to. You will not find dirty feet in a Renaissance painting. That was not what they wanted. That was not perfect. That was not ideal. And so you see kind of the realism, the harshness of this. And a great example here of the foreshortening is the gentleman who's kind of pulling the crucifix up, and he has the rope over his back. We don't see exactly we certainly don't see his face, and we don't see much of anything because he's receding into the background. He's just kind of floating back there. And even the one gentleman's face that has the red cape over his shoulder, it is so shrouded in shadow that we can't make out any more detail. It's a much more kind of vivid and dark look at the world around us. This is another one of Caravaggio's pieces. I love this one. It is called The Calling of St. Matthew. And if you notice, first and foremost, we are in a bar. Again, welcome to the Baroque period. That is where most people would spend their time after they got off of work in this period. So that is where Caravaggio set his pieces. And we're sitting in this bar, and again, we're all in contemporary dress. We're not going back to the Roman periods to reflect what the people, what Matthew really looked like. They're wearing the little feathers and the tights and everything else that the people of the Baroque era wore. And what we see here is in this, again, a very dark and kind of seedy bar, there's one shaft of light coming down through a window there that is highlighting the people. And what's kind of unique and interesting about this is Jesus is in this picture, but he is not at the center. He is all the way over to the right. And he actually even has the slightest hint of a halo, which also could be just a scratch on the wall. And I'm sure Caravaggio is having a little bit of fun there. But there is Jesus off to the side, and he is pointing at somebody at the table. But if you notice, it's kind of ambiguous, isn't it? Exactly who he's pointing at. The younger man is looking at him, kind of just like questioning. The older man with the beard is pointing, but it's unclear. Is he pointing to me? Or is he pointing to the guy with his head hunked over next to him? We don't know. And this is also kind of a beautiful depiction of what the Catholics were trying to convey, that you never know when Christ is going to walk into your life and call you to his service. And you know what? You could be sitting in a bar when it happens. So you just have to be open and aware that Christ uses all of us, no matter how horrible of sinners we are, to accomplish his goals. And so this beautiful, we got the tenebrism going on. There's a little bit of foreshortening, certainly as far as like Jesus's body is concerned, how he just kind of disappears into the background with no real detail given. And otherwise, just the beautiful representation of the subject matter and the message, basically, that the Catholics were trying to convey. This is the last piece by Caravaggio we're going to look at. This is actually the conversion of Paul. The original story goes, Paul was named Saul with an S, and he actually was a Roman, and he was the biggest persecutor of Christians around. He would lead the stonings himself. He thought that Christians were horrible. He thought that they were ruining the Roman Empire and so forth. And literally, the story goes that he was on the road to Damascus when something happened. He was riding his horse, and he felt this great force kind of push him off, and this blinding light that only he could see came and spoke to him and basically said, Saul, why are you persecuting my people? And Saul, who is laying there on the ground with his arms outstretched as if he's reaching to try to embrace the light, to embrace the voice, realizes that this is God who has come to him and basically told him, you need to stop persecuting. You need to become a Christian and actually help spread the gospel, not to crucify and otherwise punish those who agree with it. And again, we see that beautiful tenebrism with the extreme dark background, the flashlight shining upon the centerpiece. We see the intense passion and kind of sexual nature of it, where he's reaching up to embrace Christ. God is not a figure that is remote and far away from us. He is literally somebody that we should try to embrace. And then we even see that beautiful foreshortening with the horse basically not even having a head, right? It's going into the distance, the man holding him going into the distance. And everything else is just really focused on that bright, passionate light. Now, the sculpture and the paintings of this period were intense. And of course, there has to be intense music to go along with it as well. And what we see here again is the church being brilliant. They're pulling out their big guns here to try to wow all the people of Europe, to win them back to the church. And they come up with something which is going to seem strange to you, but was amazingly popular, which is opera. Now, to us, most people nowadays consider opera to be extremely boring, hard to follow, the last thing that we kind of want to do on a Saturday night and so forth. But what's interesting is that you have to kind of put yourself in the position of a typical Italian person in the 1600s. Even if you could read and everything else, you probably did not have an awful lot of books kind of available for your disposal, especially if you were poor. Also, keep in mind, the typical opera that we see nowadays is in Italian. Well, that's of course difficult for us because most of us don't speak Italian, but that would have been their native language. So this basically was the equivalent of us going to any sort of modern rock concert where we actually hear beautiful songs, we see costumes, we see stories, we get set changes, we get all the kind of the passion and excitement of a modern rock concert, but in a little bit more like poetic way, so to speak. Excuse me. And the two biggest guys in this period was a guy named Verdi, and he basically invented the concept of opera. Like, it was around a little bit before, but he took it and made it massive. And his original idea, let's put music and a story together. Let's just not sit around and sing a song. Let's actually make it a story. Which basically, if you think about it, this means that opera is basically the forerunner of movies, but with a lot more music than we have in the traditional movie now. Now, also, he started to expand the size of the orchestra. Now, if you look at like a modern day symphony with all the trumpets and all that kind of stuff that we have today, in this period, it was only about 1/4 of the size. Okay. But they started to look at that because they recognized that's like, wow, if you have 2 or 3 instruments playing together, you get kind of a lot more powerful oomph behind it than you do if it's just one. And so Monteverdi makes all these beautiful changes. And the Baroque musician that you should be most familiar with is a gentleman by the name of Vivaldi, also an Italian, who kind of took what Monteverdi did and ran with it and turned it into this amazingly powerful form. And it's very amusing in today's world. We might riot if we were forced to go to operas. In this period, they actually rioted when the operas were sold out, when they stopped their run and so forth, because they were so popular. And so ultimately what we see here is a beautiful combination of every aspect of culture, of music, of art, of sculpture, of architecture, and the church masterfully taking all of these aspects together and basically aiming them at all the Protestants, not to try to damn them, not to try to condemn them, but to try to win them back. And this completes the first section of our lesson on the Baroque period.